Welcome to our show, Sustainability the New Normal. I'm your host, Vamsi Krishna, and today on our show we have Brett Blalock from Infinity. And we're going to chat about circular supply chains with Brett, and he's going to take us on a journey explaining about the product that he built. Please introduce yourself, Brett.
Yeah, for sure. Hey, thanks for having me. My name is Brett Blalock. I'm the founder of Infinity, and we are optimizing the circular economy for goods.
Circular economy, that's definitely one of the most interesting and focusing areas, both at EvalueServe as well as this YouTube series. So, Brett, maybe before we get into that, supply chains are everywhere. We have right from the moment we use any goods, any product, any material, it goes through a very long chain of products from starting right from raw materials to more processed goods to further processed goods and then assembled goods and then the final product that we have in our hand, the phones, the laptops, the computers, right, the tables, chairs, our travel bags and everything. Products travel very long distances. What's your take on this? I mean, our world is designed in such a way that something is manufactured in China, travels thousands of miles, and maybe to Europe or to the US, right? Travels thousands of miles. Do you think all products, all goods need to go through this long journey?
Personally, I don't think so, but I know from an economic standpoint, that is sort of the driving force for it. It is pretty interesting when you think about like cotton, for example, being used in a shirt. We grow cotton here in the US, and then that cotton then gets shipped over to places like in China or what have you, where it gets remanufactured or gets manufactured, right? And then is sent back to the US. And it seems like a very inefficient process. I know over the years, right, manufacturing, at least here in the US, has been offshore to other different countries. And so as a result, this is the model that we're going off to. But who knows with more recent legislation from the upcoming administration where that will go. But there's definitely a environmental impact that's not always considered when doing all of this. And I think if consumers become much more conscious of this, I think hopefully in the future you'll see a lot more nearshoring or domestic production of products.
Do you think there is enough encouragement for products which don't have to travel a long distance in terms of some kind of subsidies, right? Some kind of incentives to make locally or grow your own food locally, and then so that it doesn't have to travel so long and in the process emit a lot of emissions? Are there enough incentives?
Right now, I don't think there are, right? I think at the end of the day, it's still financially driven. It's still cheaper to produce things, somewhere else, not in America. And so I know the recent administration wants to produce tariffs that has its own sort of economic downstream effects. So I don't know if that's going to be necessarily like the best approach, but I think encouraging more domestic production, either from like a domestic security standpoint, but also from an environmental standpoint, should be encouraged. But I think because of the economic factors, right, a lot of it, unfortunately, will have to come through from regulation. You'll always have companies, right, that are probably more niche that want to be good stewards of the economy. You'll have that. But I think for like the domestic, mainstream, at least here in the US, like it's going to be driven by regulation to do that. Unless we can get sort of technology to really make it cheaper to produce here in the US so that, to ship, as we talked about, to China, then right back here to the US is no longer as feasible.
So when we look at the environmental footprint particularly, and one of the things which is, let's say, the less talked about or rather less being addressed is the scope 3 emissions. Organizations are able to address their scope 1 and scope 2, but then scope 3, which is probably anywhere between 60 to 80 or 85%, is probably something which is much bigger in terms of addressing it. And of course that goes down the supply chains and suppliers of those suppliers and then tier 2 and then tier 3 suppliers and so on. So with respect to scope 3, right, the magnitude of this challenge is huge. From the raw materials till finished goods, scope 3 emissions are huge. In this context, how do you see circular chains coming up, circular supply chains coming up? Maybe if you could help us understand a bit better on what exactly are circular supply chains and where do they address the scope 3 emissions part or even scope 1 and 2 perhaps?
Usually, or I think as we talk about optimizing circular economy for goods, there's a need for a technology layer to support the circular economy. And so what that technology layer is doing is it's tracking and tracing products throughout its full life cycle. And this is what allows companies to start tracking that scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions and being able to then share that across different stakeholders along the supply chain. And so this is made available for further downstream manufacturers, right? If you think about the one company's scope 2 emissions is another company's scope 3, as an example. So being able to use technology to capture that and aggregate that then makes it available to further companies downstream as well as to regulators as well. And so it's not so much just like the circular economy itself, but it's more of the technology that's enabling the circular economy that is capturing those emissions.
So, when you say the use of tech here, right, are we talking about devices that are being installed within an organization's supply chains here, or are we talking about taking the data from an organization itself and providing some kind of analytics here? If you can help me understand it better.
For sure. Yeah, there's two different, I would say, means of capturing the information. So it's really going to be dependent on the organization and like the type of emissions that you're talking about. So if you think about the manufacturing facility itself, there's could be monitors or things that are installed, some sort of IoT device that's done. Probably not a lot of companies are going to invest in that. So there may be some sort of calculators that are used to just say, hey, for this type of facility, we project that it produces X amount of CO2 or so forth. And then once you start moving, so that would be that piece. And then when you start thinking about the products actually moving right along the supply chain, you'll have just different trucks, rail, planes, any sort of means of moving those goods, right? They'll have also their own environmental impact as well. And that could also be tracked either, once again, through calculators or through other emission devices that are added to it. So yeah, I think there'll be this combination of calculators and then also some sort of device attached to it to do the calculations. But once again, it'll come down most likely to cost and the investment that the company wants to make. But obviously with the addition of the IoT devices, automation can come in, which could reduce the cost for reporting these.
So is this where your solution Infinity comes in? Like, we understand that you have a solution called Infinity that really helps companies to make their supply chains go more circular. So can you help us understand how does it happen? Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. So I would say with circular supply chains, it's very driven around coordination. And that coordination was bringing all these different stakeholders together, because you think about a full, complete circular supply chain, you have the manufacturers that are creating the products, you have the brands that are designing it, but then you have the further downstream stakeholders like consumers, resale sites, recyclers, repair service providers, and all of those. And so one of the best ways to bring all of these different organizations together is to provide them with a central source of truth, so that they have the information that they need to support their function in a product's life cycle. So a great way of thinking about this is you think about a recycler. One of the big reasons why we have so much waste is that recyclers receive products and they don't understand or they don't know what it's made of. A lot of times this information is not captured by the customer that then takes it to the recycler, right? It's actually captured further upstream, and depending on the quality of the product, right, this information could have been captured like several years before it actually reached the recycler. And so being able to use a platform like ours to capture the material composition information about a product at the manufacturing level and then making that available further downstream to the recyclers, what really helps to enable the circular economy for goods.
That's amazing. So
Yeah.
what challenges did you face when you were building this product? You already knew the problem out there that existed, or like, how did you arrive at the exact problem there to solve? How did you go about while you were building your product?
So prior to this, I worked at a furniture rental company. So there, we were building circular economy tech for our business, just locally. And so we were tracking products from the manufacturer in China all the way through to end of life. And for us, end of life was selling it to a customer or selling it to a wholesaler, or eventually recycling the product if it was damaged and no longer usable. And so during that time, I was thinking more about our company and how we were doing things. And then in conjunction with that was doing a lot of research on blockchain technology. It really felt like at the time, the solution wasn't being used. This was 2021 when I was really starting to give into it. The use of NFTs and all this other tech was, I think, being misappropriated. And so the technology I thought was still really good though. And so, thinking about our company, we were just sort of localized, right? Like we were just doing a circular economy for our goods, but how could we expand that? And how could blockchain facilitate that, making it, as I said, a central source of truth for all of these disparate actors along the product's life cycle? So that was the journey of just focusing on what we were doing at Feather, and then seeing how can we then address this as a broader solution for the global economy.
So is this solution available for, or let me put it this way, your customers, are they mainly based out of the US, or are they also there in Europe? Or
So
any
right now our
other parts?
customers, Yeah, they're here domestically in the US, but we're looking to onboard companies in the UK and then the EU later. We're just here in the US, right? So it's easier to acquire folks here.
Right. So I'm sure in your line of business, you would have come across like how regulations in EU, right, particularly in this space or in the broader sustainability and circular economy space, regulations in the EU are relatively far ahead when it comes to the US, right? So, for
Yep.
example, we have the EU's Eco Design for Sustainable Products Regulation, the EU ESPR, and if you've heard of that, and under that, the EU mandates something called as a digital product passport, and within the digital product passport, every product comes with, let's say, some kind of a barcode or QR code, and when you scan it, you know the entire journey of this product, right, when it was a raw material till it's a finished good. It shows the entire travel path, the journey, the CO2 emissions in the process, and so on. And it is intended to bring awareness to people and also help companies, right, be a bit more competitive with each other when it comes to having their environmental footprint much lower. Do you
Mhm.
see or foresee such a regulation coming up in the US there, or maybe particularly in different states there, maybe in California, which is generally ahead in this area? Or do you already have such regulations, or do you see that such regulations are on the way?
Yeah. There's definitely regulations on the way. I would say there's the New York Fashion Act, which is similar to the
Right.
EU ESBR. So that one is sitting in the Senate. I believe it was brought to the floor. I don't know if they ended up actually voting on it, but that one's currently sitting out there
It's
in
been a year.
California. What were you saying?
It's been a year.
Yeah. And then you also have California that recently just passed their EPR legislation for textiles. So they have other types of EPR regulation, but this one I think had a big splash, right, because the impact of the textile industry. So that one I think will have some sort of commonalities with the EU ESPR, but won't go to the full scale as the digital product passports and the full traceability, because this particular legislation is more focused on waste diversion. So making sure that companies contribute to an organization that will then help divert waste from landfills. So it's not the full scale EU ESPR legislation, but still supported from a circular economy standpoint.
So what I'm trying to understand here is that
Mhm.
um, which particular industries or which sectors do you see there is a greater scope for implementation of solutions like Infinity here, right? I mean, to me, I see that like a lot of or almost all the manufacturing companies, right? Especially, for example, you talked about Textile Act here in New York. So definitely textile companies, right? Fashion companies, manufacturing companies, or packaging goods materials, consumer goods companies. A lot of these industries would have to, let's say, try to develop or advance their circular supply chains there. Which industry out there do you see is taking the lead?
I would say fashion, at
Mm-hmm.
least. And, that could be biased just for the sense that we work mostly with fashion brands right now. And I think that's mostly driven by the environmental impact that fashion has. I think the other thing too, right, is it's everybody wears clothes, right? 99% of people, right, wear clothes. And so, so I think it's very tangible for people, the impact. And, I have like a stat that said that the EPA here in the US, they did a study back in 2018 that found that 17 million tons of textile waste is generated annually by US consumers, and 85% of that ends up in landfills. So I think the problem is pretty massive and also too very tangible. I think another industry that I would say is a bit of a dark horse that people don't talk about as much is furniture. Furniture has similar waste characteristics, right? And you do have some similar economic incentives around like the fast fashion. You also have fast furniture as well. You think about like IKEA, right? That furniture really, or Wayfair here in the US, that stuff only lasts one move, right? And ultimately gets thrown away after that. So I would say that is an industry that's a bit of a dark horse that has similar mechanics that people don't always talk about. Consumer electronics, right, is another good one for this as well. You think about all the rare earth metals that get thrown away and tossed every single year that could be extracted, given the importance of them for EV batteries and other electronics as well.
Wow. So furniture is definitely something that came up as a surprise, and even as you mentioned, right, it's a kind of a dark horse. But also, what's interesting is that furniture is a highly fragmented industry, if I understand it
Mhm.
correctly. It's like maybe for the big majors like IKEA and a few others, furniture is relatively, I think, a more fragmented industry, which makes it even more difficult to address the problem at scale, perhaps. But I think it's given your experience in that industry, so I think that sounds definitely like an interesting problem for that industry. Uh, have you also tried working with, because you're talking about how the problem of waste going to landfills, less of it being recycled, have you also been, let's say, able to work with the municipalities of a city or a county or a district? Do you think that solutions like Infinity, for example, would be applicable there for them?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, we're definitely in chat with, we're here in LA, so we're definitely in talks with LA Sanitation. There's also Cal Recycle, which manages recycling programs across the state of California. So we're in discussions with them. Yeah, it's very, and going back to what I mentioned before about the coordination aspect, is like, yeah, there's coordinations between the companies themselves, the consumers, as well as the regulators or the local jurisdictions. And so, yeah, we very much see ourselves as like the connector, if you will, across all these different stakeholders. So yeah, very much see, because these sanitation programs, right, in local jurisdictions, they're managing this waste as well. And so it's good to
Right.
work with them and see how can you make their processes more efficient.
Great. Uh, so, as you mentioned earlier, that you work with a lot of fashion companies out there, right? If you could give me one example, right? Maybe you don't have to take the name of the company or your customer, but if you can help me understand, how does one of your customers use your product, and like how does it basically help them to make their supply chains go more circular?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So what we're doing is as you mentioned this before, the digital product passports, we're creating those for our goods. I think another way to think about it is a digital twin for the physical good. And that digital
Right.
twin is what's capturing all of the environmental impact of the product as it flows through its life cycle. And so for brands, there's other ancillary benefits that they're looking for as well. So we have one company that was wanting to use the information that we're capturing for carbon offsets, right? So they could use that to purchase it. Other brands have been using this information, as you talked about before, about sharing it with their consumers, and being able to prove like, hey, we say that we're a sustainable supply chain. We use ethical facilities. Like, here's the proof, here's the information, and we're willing to make that public for you. So there's an element of building trust and brand building, and then also, we've also seen other companies then trying to take sort of a standard like digital product passport where you have all the product details, environmental impact, and then expanding upon that to create more of a customer like engaging type experience. So we've had other companies use it to like tack on different perks, different things, even like an AR experience. So wanting to enhance that experience, not just make it about like, here's the product, but also engage consumers as well.
Okay, so what you said about companies able to generate a carbon credit suddenly got my interest there. Who is verifying this? Like, which registry is verifying this carbon credit, if you're aware of it?
Yeah, so right now it's still in the early stages, but it was more so not so much like them generating carbon credits. It's them wanting to say, okay, cool. They're using our system to say, okay, we moved this product from point A to point B, right? This generated X amount of CO2. Let's
Right.
then buy like a carbon offset for that trip or what have you. Or we manufactured a batch. Let's go buy carbon credits for that. So yeah, it's more around just wanting to buy offsets to reduce the impact on the environment.
Right. And with your solution, are they also able to generate something, how do you say, a plastic credit or a plastic recycling note for the tons of plastic that they have been able to avoid? Or, yeah, like for example, I'm sure you've heard of the plastic recycling note, right, which is there in the UK for X amount of plastic that you have not used or you've avoided or you've recycled, right? You're able to generate one such PRN. So, do you also, apart from the carbon credit point, does this also extend to resources like plastic and paper or some other wastes?
Yeah, it can. It hasn't come up just yet, but yeah, it can. I mean, we're tracking the material composition of products, right? So if you have all this information out of them, you know how much plastic that you're using, what types of plastics that you're using, all that can be aggregated and then shared into a report that's used later. As far as like what's missing, right, in that we are able to accept raw materials into the system, and then we can then track that raw material to the creation of the finished good. So if there is excess or anything that's not in there, once again, like that information could be run through some sort of analytics engine and generated as a report. So it hasn't come up yet, but I see it being possible within the solution.
Okay. So when you talk to your customers first, what kind of questions did they have regarding circular supply chains? Or maybe perhaps they didn't have the concept of circular supply chains, or maybe that's not what they had in their mind. What was the problem that they came to you for, right, when they talked about? And how does it fit in the bigger picture of circular economy?
For sure. Yeah, I would say, the majority of companies that are coming to us are aware of the circular economy. It's a part of their brand, it's part of their image, because we're still, I would say, in the early stages. So we're working with those early adopters right now. So for them, they're wanting to understand, like, how can they help enable the circular economy for their goods, but also how can this help them comply with upcoming regulations as well. And so there is, I would say, that is a draw, is the compliance angle, but also to, like, how can we prove this to our customers? How can we also help facilitate the circularity too? So.
That's interesting. So, how do you see that companies are effectively able to integrate circular economy principles into their supply chains while simultaneously they're trying to enhance their ESG materiality as well, right? ESG performance. Have you been able to work with companies which are also like they bring in the ESG element of their ESG element into this? Like, how do you see circular supply chains addressing or helping them improve their ESG metrics there?
Yeah, and ESG, are we talking about like the environmental impact, but also fair wages and things like that? Yeah,
Right.
yeah. So yeah, I would say it's more around like the traceability element that plays in. And so if we're tracking and tracing these products, right, as we talked about before, capturing material information and things like that, we're also capturing the origin of where this product came from. And then different organizations along that supply chain can upload their credentials. So then that's made available, right? You can say like, hey, this product was sourced from a RAP certified facility because we'd have those credentials, they're in the system, and then that can be retrieved later down the road. Should a brand need to know, okay, which part of our supply chain is certified, which ones aren't, and then maybe let's like work with them to get certified so that we can prove to our customers, hey, we have a fully certified chain, as an example.
Isn't even I would say that companies which are into, for example, agriculture industry or
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I think agriculture industry or food production industry, even small scale enterprises or medium scale or even large scale enterprises, I think they would find aspects related to traceability would be which would be highly relevant that could use a solution like Infinity.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, we've definitely talked to and investigating agriculture as well. There is an overlap, right, with the food production as well as with clothing production. You're still at the end of the day, a lot of the raw materials, at least if it's 100%
Right.
cotton, right, is coming from a farm. And so yeah, there's definitely an interest from that, and we're exploring those as well. Because the great thing about creating these digital twins or doing this traceability is that if there's ever some sort of outbreak that occurs with the food product or whatever you think, like an E. coli or what have you, it's much easier for these companies to assess, okay, which batch did it come from, which location came from, so they can reduce that time to understand like who's all affected by this outbreak, take that from weeks and convert it down to hours or and so forth.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I think this was quite interesting for me to understand how this solution runs in the background, which is like some sort of a dark night, which is really helping companies get more cleaner. And what's your take in the coming 5 to 10 years? How do you see this domain grow, right? From maybe something which is even entirely out of scope of product like Infinity in the larger picture, right? In the larger landscape of sustainability and a lot of regulatory compliance coming in, how do you see circular supply chains or the demand for them, right, grow? And where do you see the growth spurt that would take this industry further?
Yeah, for sure. I think you're going to see it coming from two angles. You're going to see it coming from consumers, younger consumers in particular. Gen Z are most notable for this, but also the millennials as well. You're going to see a lot of growth in this. And I think a great example of this is the growth in the secondary market. This market will be valued at $73 billion in the next several years. And a lot of that is due to the fact that younger generations know that goods already created are much more sustainable than any newly created product, right? And so that's why you're seeing much more folks purchase goods in the secondary market. You also have 50% of consumers now that are considering sustainability when making purchasing decisions. And then I have another stat too that says there's like over 25 different legislation, both in the US and the EU, focused on sustainability. So this could be packaging. We talked about the EU ESPR. We talked about the California EPR bill. So I think you're going to see more of this type of regulation coming from here domestically in the US, but also in the EU, but also consumer demands driving companies to be more circular. And I think from there, right, that in order to make the circular economy more efficient, companies will then need to redesign their products as well. So while we provide the tech solution to enable the circular economy for goods, there also needs to be a design change from companies to help make that process better. Right? You think about, we'll go with a jacket, for example. A big problem with jackets or any product that has a zipper associated to it is it's very expensive to remove that zipper. And so could brands redesign their products so that removing the zippers is much more efficient, so that they can be broken down and then separated to different waste streams so that they can be recycled much more effectively?
That's definitely amazing. And I think maybe in the US, particularly, a few states might take a much further lead than very few states would take lead compared to the majority of the other states. And I believe even perhaps at a national level, I think that it might come at a much later stage, but maybe a few states like California or New York might probably take the lead in this case in driving the sustainability agenda.
Yeah, and I think at least from the fashion side for sure, because LA, New York are like our biggest fashion, because if you
Right.
will, here in the US. So I think you're going to see a lot of there, but there is other, states like Washington and Oregon that do have other, and you can even look at Colorado. There's several other states that have like packaging focused legislation too. So I think you'll kind of see probably like a fragmented piece in the US, and then hopefully later down the road there'll be some more national. But I think it depends. I think you may have legislation like the UFLPA, where the US is concerned about brands sourcing products from forced labor regions in China. And so I think there may be situations in which the US sees it beneficial to adopt more like circular or other types of sustainability focused regulation to just support the resiliency of the U.S. Manufacturing sector.
So, Brett, maybe before we part, I'm just curious to understand: was there something that inspired you to start your journey in this space? Like, did you read a book, or did you maybe at your workplace something that happened, or like what inspired you to work in the more circular supply chain space?
Yeah, it definitely started working at Feather, which is the furniture rental company I mentioned. That started there. But I
Right.
think just as an individual, someone that doesn't like to purchase excess stuff and really tries to live a pretty minimalist lifestyle, I think that circular economy thing really resonated well with me. And I think if you think about even from just like a natural perspective, the things in nature are created, they break down, and then they're brought back into the ecosystem. And that's why they call it the circle of life, right? So and it very much feels like what we're doing is disruptive to that and is the complete opposite of how things work naturally. And so I think when I think about those just core principles and things, it just resonated well with me.
That's definitely, here and for this show, we say that sustainability, the new normal. We're saving the planet one episode at a time, and I think I think it connects quite well with what you just mentioned and your story as well. Brett, thank you very much for joining us today and sharing your story as well as the journey, and also helping us understand how different solutions out there are helping organizations to make their supply chains more circular and more sustainable. Thank you once again for joining us.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.